early stuff that I did was black and white stuff for Image Comics, a book called Paradigm, and it was weird, very David Lynchian kind of inspired, and dealt a lot in cerebral horror. Since then I've worked in just about every genre there is. I did superhero stuff for DC. I did a lot of indie books that were some kind of horror. My most recent projects are The Beauty for Image Comics, which is kind of a body horror sort of thing. It's about an STD that makes you beautiful, and obviously if you can catch something that's going to make you beautiful, there probably eventually is a downside. And so it's about learning what that downside is. And then I do with Seth, The Realm, which is a post-apocalyptic high fantasy book. So it's got all the genres. I think one of the things that we're going to find throughout this conversation is really the good storytelling, or even moderate storytelling, often has more than one genre at play. The Realm is an adventure book. It's a fantasy book, but it also has a lot of horror elements in there. We just had in Arc 2 this whole big bit with crazy spider creature that is terrorizing the group. As far as where I came from with horror, I was scared of everything as a kid. I was that 11-year-old kid that was up with like the blankets up here and literally could not sleep at night. And so I thought that in order to counter that, I was going to watch every horror film in my local video store, and I did that and realized that there was nothing to be scared of at all. The stuff, all Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers especially for me, they died at the end, and it was actually the creatures, the monsters in these movies were fascinating to me, and I kind of got addicted to horror and found myself wanting to tell those kinds of stories for the rest of my career.
I probably follow a similar path. Over the years, I've illustrated a lot of ghost stories and Victorian Gothic stories. I've worked with a lot of dead authors that I suppose are well known, H.G. Wells and H.P. Lovecraft, to name a few, William Hope Hodgson. I work with a lot of current authors like George R. R. Martin and Ray Bradbury. And the great thing that Jeremy points out is that we're not just talking about horror, but there are other aspects to horror, adventure, and even comedy, because we were talking about Bride of Frankenstein before, and that's one of the great comedies in the Universal Library of horror films. And I just want to say that I prepared a little extra for this particular panel, and I don't usually do this, but today, and I don't want to scare Jeremy because I know he's, but I wear my Frankenstein socks. So I just want you to know how seriously we take this.
Top that, Sid.
Yeah, my name is Seth Peck. Like I said, I'm a writer. One of my first comic book writing experience was I co-wrote a miniseries. It was a horror miniseries, kind of a possession, ghost kind of thing, for Image that I co-wrote with Rick Remender. And then I did some anthology stuff, and I haven't done a lot of straight horror. Like Jeremy said, The Realm, there's definitely some elements of horror in there. There's monsters, and there's kind of the real world horror of kind of surviving when things are bleak or there's not a lot of humanity left. As far as comics and horror, kind of for me, horror comics are sort of what got me back into comics, or let me see comics as something beyond like Spider-Man and stuff. I read Spider-Man probably when I was 4 or 5 years old. I remember being a kid going into a 7-Eleven and picking up an issue of Swamp Thing off the spinner rack. It was during Alan Moore's run. It was the one, I don't know if anybody's read it, but the kids that go swimming in the pool or in the lake, and the one kid that won't come out, and he's kind of pale and floating out there, and they pan down, and there's like underwater vampires like sucking on his leg. That was kind of the first thing where I realized like comic books could be something besides like superheroes and stuff. So in a lot of ways, horror comic books are sort of what brought me into comic books as a bigger picture. That led me to track down like that there was a Clint's comic book store at Metcalf South back when Metcalf South was there, and then that opened my eyes to start reading like Judge Dredd and just stuff that wasn't typical Marvel DC stuff. So
what is it in particular about the genre, whether we're talking comics specifically or across multimedia, that you feel like is universal? Because we've talked about how horror, yes, but horror is found in adventure, horror is found in comedy, that feeling of, having your breath sucked away for a moment, and that chill that goes down your spine, whatever, however you feel when you feel afraid. What is it that you feel about the genre that speaks to a universal audience, whether regardless of culture, regardless of language, regardless of whatever, that makes horror so endearing and so enduring?
I think it's nice whenever you are having a really bad time, life's tough, the world itself can be rather terrifying. To look at these situations and see, these people running from a mass killer or a terrible monster, it's like it kind of gives you
Puts your day in perspective.
Right, puts your day in perspective. It kind of gives you that feeling. I think that, obviously depending on the subgenre or two, you can get a lot of real beauty in the idea of horror and monsters and these things. I think, I love it when creatives explore situations where the most human characters in the story are the monsters, and then humanity itself is terrifying.
Is the monster.
Right.
Absolutely.
This doesn't answer your question, but I was just thinking about the title of this panel, How to Do Horror Right, I think it was called. I suppose there's a lot of ways to do horror right, but I was thinking, I don't really know how you could do horror wrong. And maybe if you did do horror wrong, maybe it would be more horrible. That's just a
Or
thought.
horrific, it's not that horrific.
Horrific, yeah. But I think there's like, to follow up on Jeremy's line, there's poetry in a lot of the stuff that scares us, and there's that sense that we were all kids once, and maybe we were watching Scooby-Doo when we were 4 or 5, or classic horror films, but the sense that, well, I'm scared, but I'm safe. My mom is sitting over on that couch there. I can't worry about it too much, and it's fun to be scared. I think everybody likes to be scared. In comics, it's a little harder to do, I think. When I was a kid, the Creepy and Eerie magazines were coming out, and there was all this great art. And
We
they
got a few of those. Yeah, there's on the monitor over there.
Oh yeah, I'm sure a lot of you remember those, or if you haven't, they're worth looking up, because they would adapt a lot of the great classic stories by Poe and Lovecraft, August Derleth, all these guys, and great artwork connected with it as well. So that was one of my first experiences to horror in comics. If you haven't seen them, check them out.
Yeah, I think kind of what you're saying, fear kind of is a primal, like it ties into kind of very basic urges that we have in terms of survival. So we're kind of all, there's that trigger mechanism in everybody to sort of have a chemical or a psychological reaction to fear. So for some people, it's calming to be able to look at the monster in a book or in a movie and kind of have it, and have that, know you have that safety distance. For other people, it can be more of a chemical thing. Like, that's why you get people that love roller coasters or love, like there's a physiological response to fear. And then I think it's also true that everybody's afraid of something. It doesn't, have to take a different shape. It could be something very simple like a spider or a snake, or it could be a metaphysical, or fear of a panda. But everybody has that, so it lets you tell a broad range of stories, because there's an audience for sort of every sort of fear that you have. There's a way that you try to put that into a story.
Very good. I see a question down front. Yes, go ahead.
Bouncing off of the concept of fear, this is one of those, what is your favorite kind of questions. What is something that people find terrifying that you find the most fascinating and enjoy writing about?
I think one of the things I find fascinating is I don't know if it's necessarily fear, but kind of the motivation of the villain. Like for me, when I see a movie or read a story, it's very easy for me to something tends to scare me is the stuff that could maybe happen, like a serial killer, or even something that's maybe supernatural, like, I don't know if you guys have probably seen Hereditary, like something like that where it's, I couldn't tell you 1,000% that's not a real thing. I don't think I believe in demons, but I wouldn't want to, wouldn't want to put money on it. So I think for me, it's the most fascinating stuff is being able to sort of kind of, there's little distance between our world and the world they're showing. It's to me, that's a lot scarier. Outside of like jump scare stuff, which I think probably works on any level for, I mean, the Jack in the Box type of thing is a very basic, but in terms of movies that kind of stick with me, it's why things like maybe David Lynch or stuff that's unsettling, I think it sort of sticks with you a little more.
Disturbing. Yeah, and just to follow up on that, one of the books lately that just terrified me was Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Now, there was a fairly plausible situation that it didn't have much of a backstory to it. We don't know what happened in the world, but just the idea that you were out there with maybe a son or a daughter trying to navigate through bands of horrible maniacs. That was probably the scariest thing I've seen in a long time.
If you read Blood Meridian's another Cormac McCarthy book, it's so Western, but I would almost say you could make that a horror.
Yeah,
It's got some pretty overt.
Yes, that as
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
with the Indians and so forth. Someone recently asked me if I wanted to illustrate The Road, and I turned it down, because it was too disturbing, and I don't feel like spending the next 6 months living that book. And I think it works better in theater of the mind. It doesn't really need illustrations.
Right.
There are some stories, some novels that I think just work all up here, and if anything, illustrations are going to lessen the somehow the immediate connection between reader and author.
It's actually a pretty good point though about like, while you're writing something, it's in your head for this is not a writers versus artists comment, but like, when you're writing something, it takes a certain amount of time. When you're drawing it, it takes days and days to do something. So if you're picking out The Road, for instance, there are very traumatic moments in that story that you know you're gonna have to draw. And you're gonna have to live with that for days on end. And I think that it's traumatic to you as the viewer looking at something, but then there's a special trauma that we go through where we have to draw this stuff, and like, it can be.
You gotta empathize.
Yeah. Well, you feel that pain, you feel the horror, you feel the, sometimes stuff is really gross, and you're like, I have a buddy and he researches everything that he draws, and he'll get an incredibly gory sequence, and he'll look up exactly what a shotgun blasted head looks like or whatever. And I'm a wimp, I can't do that. So I'm like, I kind of know anatomy, and I kind of know what that looks like, and I've seen enough movies that I'll make it look gross, but I'm never going to be like, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna spend the next, 2 weeks researching.
And I think if you're keeping something like comic specific, where you're talking about imagery, where these guys have to draw something, you don't have that kind of, I was thinking of this sort of the H.P. Lovecraft cheat of like, it was so horrifying you can't describe it. Like, well, that's
You
these guys
can't, you don't
basically
get,
have-
you get paid to
Right.
describe it.
As a writer, you can kind of say how terrible it must have been, but these guys, actually have to pick. Or if they're doing, if you're illustrating, for example, The Road, you would have to select specific shots of this is the image that's going to convey all the feeling of this chapter. So these guys really have to kind of pick their shots in terms of what you're going to show visually.
Yeah. I've worked with enough authors, and I try to keep their intent. When somebody like Lovecraft talks about, the horror he sees out of the corner of his eye for a second, and doesn't describe it, or else he'd go mad, and you would go mad. I try not to draw that. I may show it in a shadow, because I think these guys went out of their way to keep those things somewhat intangible, and for an illustrator to crystallize it is, at least for me, I think it's just doing a disservice to the author's intent.
That's got to be tough visually, because you think about, even in movies, like that's a pretty common complaint in a horror movie, is, oh, I saw too much of the monster, or it's always scary, like, when you don't see it, and that's kind of, you guys don't really get that luxury when you're illustrating a horror comic.
artists understand the need to not completely show it. So yeah, it's a
Well,
catch-22.
I'd rather leave someone asking for more, especially with something like Cthulhu, because if you've read that material, he describes Cthulhu in several different ways. Sometimes he's a toadish sort of gaseous entity, and at other times he's this octopus, a squid-like figure. But what was my point to this? I don't know. Just
No, that's fine, that's great, because I think it's important that a lot of horror is visual. We are built, we are evolved to be very visual creatures. So let's talk a little bit about, but before we get to the visual piece, I see a hand, and I don't want to lose this guy. So I don't want you to hold your hand while we talk about something for 10 minutes. So go ahead and ask your question, but be thinking in terms of visual transfer.
It does tie into the visual thing.
Great, thank you.
If you are trying to build suspense and impact in the comic book, how would you do that with like panel layouts?
Well, that's a good question. I was working with Mike Mignola on a Hellboy story called Into the Silent Sea. And, he's sort of, I've known Mike for 25 years, and he wrote a 3-page treatment. He said, okay, you can finish it. And I said, well, you're leaving it all up to me? He goes, yeah. And I said, well, it's not gonna look like your stuff, Mike. And he said, well, I'd be disappointed if it did. And at any rate, when I was working on it, there's a scene where a dead guy is laying on a table in the hull of a ship, and a carpenter is making a coffin for him, and he's tapping on the side of the coffin, and this guy wakes up, this dead guy wakes up, and he gets off the table, and the carpenter says, oh, yeah, I'm surprised you're still alive with that hole in your head, but I'm really glad to see you. And the monster comes over and starts to strangle the guy. And as I was laying out that page, I came to the last panel, and I had these hands around the neck of the carpenter, and he's screaming. And I thought, no, this isn't right. So I decided, instead of such an overt visual, I decided to cut to a box of tools falling off the table, and they're just all scattering all over the place. But when I did that, I thought, yeah, now this is comics at its best, because you're thinking like a little bit more like a filmmaker, which you need to. And I thought the violence is implied here, and I have nothing against your friend, showing graphic violence, but I'm a little bit more of a romantic in my horror, and I would prefer if I can figure out another way to do that rather than show some brain splattering or something. I just feel it's another way to go that might help ratchet up the horror. Hope that helps.
I always think with, in comics, you don't get the jump scare. Like, there's no way to really, even if you're doing, like, a lot of what you would do in those situations is you take and have that moment before the big moment at the end of the page, and then you do the page turn, and that's the big reveal. So you see the creature kind of starting to come around the corner, and then you turn the page, and then you see the creature actually reveal on the next page. Well, that's about as good as we get. So everything that we do is truly based on building atmosphere and building feeling, and trying to ratchet up tension as much as you can without being able to have that move.
I always try to, as a writer, I always try to leave the script loose enough that the artist can kind of determine pacing. And like you said, there may be a specific moment where, okay, this needs to happen on the flip side so that we can reveal something. And then you do actually have to think of how is this going to be. And we've done that several times in On the Run. Like, all right, page 1 is going to be here, page 2 is going to be here. Like when I've done Marvel stuff, when I'm sure you guys have seen it happen in comics, you don't know where they're going to put ads either. So you don't know if you're trying to set tension in a scene or a reveal, and then all of a sudden there's like a full-page Snickers ad or something. And so that your thing is thrown, like you can really throw it off. So it's tough. I mean, it's easier in creator-owned work, or if you're doing like a graphic novel where you're not going to be interrupted by ads. It's definitely simpler.
I like the I'm terrified.
Yeah, well, the Snickers ad.
That might be good placing if you're paying, if your Snickers paying for that,
And
yeah.
the Snickers ones now look like comic book pages, and they've got like Superman and Batman, so they really kind of almost halfway blend in with the comic you're reading.
I have done that on
Yeah,
occasion.
they're right. You're like, I didn't realize Snickers was a part of this, and Batman's an issue of Spider-Man.
Back here, I'll go here and then I'll come to you next, okay? Go ahead.
I just was wondering, what's your favorite situation to try to visually express? Do you have one?
Are you asking like a specific, like, I like drawing puppies? Or are you asking like, I like drawing
Well, like-
excitement or surprise?
Instead of
Or
like, what's your favorite monster draw? Like, you know, someone's running out of the grass and then something jumped out, like that, the situation itself that you have.
The
to express
situation,
in such a
okay.
way, Yeah.
I like building dread a lot. I think that especially in comics, that's something that you can do where you know that something is coming, you know it's building to that, and trying to convey. I love little bits of character business. You know, like you'll have somebody and they're uncomfortable and they're sitting there and they're fidgeting with their phone. So you might see the look on their face, but then you might see their hand kind of flipping or doing that, or a nervous, twitch or scratching their face or something like that as this thing is going. So I really love the juxtaposition there where you're building tension. Maybe you see the creature coming and then you see them sitting there, and the realization. I don't know. I have a lot of friends that they're kind of really obsessive about wanting fewer panels on pages. And one of the things in the realm that I think that Seth and I abuse ourselves with regularly is like, he'll hand me a page and he's like, we need some extra moments here. This page is gonna have 7 panels. And I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna put 9 on there. And it's just because that's what we do. I like building moments as much as you can.
For me, I think I tend to favor period pieces and atmosphere. I don't have a lot of interest in doing current street scenes with horror on it. I'd rather do some spooky castle or a mausoleum somewhere. That's the kind of stuff. I think it kind of falls into a fantasy as well, but I like those visuals more.
It's like the classic, you're coming up on Frankenstein's castle shot.
Yes. Unless you had something.
I don't draw, so as a reader, I was gonna say I enjoy like you were saying, like Gary's work, for example, where it's atmospheric and it's, even if it's not specifically gothic, it kind of has that feel or that lighting, and that to me is a lot more evocative of what I picture as horror than, like you said, like a guy on a street corner, like modern day stuff. So.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Okay, yeah, I got 2 things. You just mentioned the ads. I think it'd be great if it was talking Twinkies for Hostess fruit pies. That'd be amazing. And 2,
I'm sure he eats them, yeah.
Yeah. 2, you're talking about kind of building suspension and having the reveal in the comics and the lack of the jump scare. But Junji Ito, I'm probably not saying that right. The Japanese horror guy. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but
Yeah.
several of those were like the final page or the final panel, and it's not a jump scare, but it's definitely building up and then suddenly blam.
Is he like the Flying Schoolhouse or the Magic? What's the?
So he did,
not the Magic Schoolhouse.
Yes, the magic school lesson very important. Yes.
Haunted Classroom or the?
He did like Uzumaki and
Okay.
so just Spiral in the States.
The one with the holes in the side of the mountain and people just possessed and just go into that hole.
I would say Japanese comics, I don't have a huge, I'm not super familiar, but I would say I've seen a lot of stuff from those that visually is pretty, image-wise is pretty spooky looking stuff.
I'm glad you actually mentioned that, because I was going to talk about specifically his work, because there is something in that is absolutely upsetting. And I think a lot of what he works with is body horror and stuff, so you'll turn a page and somebody will have twisted their body around so much that, it's just this terrible disturbing thing. And like you said, it's not a jump scare, but it's picking a moment that is absolutely abusive to the eye when you turn the page sometimes, which really works. It's really gross.
Yeah. It's not just for Japanese anime comics.
Right.
It's its own thing.
Yeah.
say too, like, again, I come back to the Alan Moore Swamp Thing run, I think that's about if I were gonna say like, what's the best you've ever seen horror done in comics, that would probably be my choice, and I don't know how much that's Alan Moore and how much that's been set in total with the guys that were drawing it, but visually, like, they had the equivalent of some jump scares, I feel like, in there, like, there was some visually arresting stuff, and when you came to it, you know, he had a way of, you know, there was the monster that the in-bunch that had its head backwards and the hand sewn in its back and came running out of the closets. There was a lot of that kind of stuff that
I'm sure that stuff is pretty seamless between writer and artist, probably the way you guys work, it's very organic, and you can't quite tell where somebody begins and the other person leads off. I think that's the best way to go, take Lee and Kirby. for
Yeah.
example. Yes?
Yes, ma'am, right here.
There was an article last year talking about the importance of isolation in horror stories, whether physical isolation like cabin in the woods, way out in the country, or like more personal isolation, way people even in large cities, they're not, a lot of people don't talk to their neighbors, they don't know a lot of people around them. How do you, do those elements you guys use in your stories, and if so, how do you use them?
The realm deals with that a lot. I think while it's not a straight horror comic, it is apocalyptic, and you are cut off from. There's no communications, electronic stuff like that. I don't know how much of that arises from a storytelling standpoint. If it simplifies things, like Friday the 13th or something, they're alone in the woods. It's kind of like doesn't work as well if they can call the police. Doesn't work as well if they have a lot of people around. So I don't know if it's chicken or egg. You know, which if we isolate it because that's a subconscious fear of ours, or if we started, doing the isolation because it kept the story simplified. But again, I think it goes back to that everybody can identify with it. Everybody can identify with feeling isolated. And maybe it's an easier way to kind of put you in the character's shoes, and you start thinking about what would I do if I was stuck, in this situation. And some of the best movies, I think, in terms of kind of ratcheting up tension, are ones like, what did I just see, like Splinter, I think was a movie I just saw recently, where they're like trapped in a gas station with things. So, or Cujo, where they're trapped, and the whole thing takes place. What's
What's the sex story in King Road?
Oh, Gerald's Game, where she's
Yeah.
handcuffed to the bed, and she's, yeah, you're right, that is a very common, and I think it takes away a lot of your, the comfort you have with other people, and it kind of ratchets up and magnifies the tension because you're kind of dealing with it all on your own.
It also magnifies point of view really well. If you are, you were so in her head, trapped there with her husband laying there dead on the floor, and like those moments, you have one character in a situation or a few characters. That isolation, it's not like you're picking your favorite person out of the group and trying to identify with them. It's like you're stuck into that one point of view, and it really affects you.
Yeah, I agree. Good questions. Any other questions right now? If not, we'll continue. Yes, sir.